Hello, my name is Broderick Morgan, and I am doing my cultural analysis presentation on the Navajo Nation. My objective during this presentation is to give support to two theories that I feel play a vital role in the health disparities seen in the Navajo Nation when compared to the rest of society, and provide possible solutions to close these disparities through cultural awareness, improving health behaviors, and collaboration with healthcare providers and healthcare systems. The two theories I will examine during this presentation are the risk exposure theory and the resource deprivation theory. The risk exposure theory states that high prevalence of social and environmental health risks in predominantly minority communities leads to a higher prevalence of disease and death. The resource deprivation theory states that racial and ethnic health disparities exist because minorities are more likely than whites to live in communities that are lacking the necessary infrastructure for a healthy lifestyle. First, I would like to provide you with some cultural insight and history of the Navajo Nation. The Navajo Nation is the largest federally recognized American Indian tribe in the United States, with a population of 320,000, of which 205,696 reside on the reservation. Additionally, it is the largest land-based reservation extending into parts of Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico, covering over 27,000 square miles and including all or parts of 13 counties in those states. Anthropologists believe that Navajo probably arrived in the Southwest somewhere between 800 to 1,000 years ago by way of Canada. The Navajo people call themselves Dine, which means the people. They can trace their descendants as far back as the 13th century. Ways of life. The Navajo are believed to have learned farming shortly after arriving in the Southwest and became acquainted with domesticated livestock after contact with the Spanish. They became very skillful shepherds and horsemen. The traditional dwelling of the Navajo was a small dome-shaped house constructed from wood and clay called a hogan. The door typically faces the east to receive the blessings of the day's first rays of sun. The Navajo practice a religion called Hozo, which refers to how everything is interconnected both physically and spiritually, and how they affect the health and well-being of all things. The economy of the early Navajo was largely dependent on farming. Raising sheep and goats provided substantial quantities of meat and milk, as well as hides, wool, and lambs that were exchanged for manufactured goods. Additional income was derived from the sale or exchange of various craft products such as pottery and rugs. Native Americans are known for being the first people on the land before European and Spanish came and invaded. After the Spanish had settled into Navajo society, there was some hostility between the two groups, and then the Americans came along and demanded their land. When the Navajo refused to surrender their land, the European Americans invaded, and what led to historically is known as the Long Walk. The Long Walk took place between 1863 and 1864. The goal of the walk was to force the Navajo off their land. A 300-mile trek in the dead of winter was walked by over 8,000 children, women, and men that took about 2 months to complete to a small designated reservation area in New Mexico. Once the designation was reached, an estimated 200 people had died from starvation and exposure to the elements. After 4 years having endured overcrowding and miserable living conditions on the reservation, the Navajo signed the U.S. Navajo Treaty of 1868. The treaty allowed the Navajo to return to a small portion of their original homeland in parts of Arizona and New Mexico. The U.S. government promised basic services in exchange for peace, none of which were included access or the benefit of healthcare services. The Navajo would suffer another traumatic experience some 50 years later. The Navajo Livestock Reduction Act in the 1930s took a tremendous toll on the Navajo people when they were forced to reduce their livestock herds related to what the U.S. government called overgrazing. Over 80% of their livestock was exterminated by the government. Livestock revenue contributed to over half the Navajos' income at that time. This act in itself devastated their economy. The Navajos still suffer health disparities. The social confinement and lack of resources and loss of economic freedom associated with these traumatic historic experiences could be considered the catalyst for the health disparities and health indicators facing the Navajo people today. The Navajo people have long experienced lower health status when compared with other Americans. Lower life expectancy and disproportionate disease burden exist perhaps because of inadequate education, disproportionate poverty, discrimination in the delivery of health services, and cultural differences. These are qualities of life issues are rooted in economic adversity and poor social economic conditions. Other issues that plague the Navajo lies in maternal child health. 14% of Navajo mothers develop diabetes during pregnancy. 61% of Navajo mothers do not take a multivitamin or prenatal vitamin during pregnancy. 20% of Navajo mothers reported symptoms of postpartum depression. 14% of babies born to Navajo mothers are admitted to the NICU. 20% of Navajo mothers reported not having enough food during their pregnancy. Other disparities in the Navajo people are their suicide rates as compared to the rest of the country. The suicide rate in the Navajo is over 3 times the national average, despite Native Americans only accounting for 1.2% of the U.S. population. Health indicators. Native Americans continue to die at higher rates than other Americans in many categories, including chronic liver disease, cirrhosis, diabetes, unintentional injuries, assault and homicide, intentional self-harm/suicide, and chronic lower respiratory diseases. Infrastructure, poverty, and access to health care. The Navajo Nation lacks major infrastructure to support a healthy and safe living environment. The employment rate currently sits at 11%, that nearly triples the U.S. average. 38% of the residents of the Navajo Nation live below the poverty line, and another 19% suffering what is considered extreme poverty. Today, the Navajo are still living in primarily primitive conditions. An estimated 32% of the homes on the reservation do not have electricity. 31% lack indoor plumbing, and another 38% of the homes do not have running water. Transportation. Access to basic health care services present challenges for the majority of the Navajo people due to isolation and remoteness of rural areas where they live. Lack of family transportation or the cost of fuel is often factors restricting access to needed health care services for families living in these remote areas. About 78% of the roads on the Navajo Nation reservation are dirt and unpaved. Travel can be increasingly difficult and treacherous during inclement weather conditions. Food insecurities. Health indicators that affect the Navajos, such as diabetes, hypertension, obesity, and cardiovascular disease, are linked to food insecurities, particularly diabetes and obesity. The U.S. Department of Agriculture Food Desert Locator shows that nearly all of Navajo Nation is a food desert. This means that there is limited or no access to healthy, nutritious foods like fresh fruit and vegetables. The entire Navajo Nation only has 10 grocery stores for the 27,000 square miles, and many can be as far as 60 miles away. Many Navajo families do not have means of transportation to drive these long distances or the financial resources to secure healthier alternative food choices, so they rely on unhealthy alternative food sources from gas stations, convenience stores, flea markets, and trading posts. One of the United Nations Sustainable Developmental Goals is to prevent hunger and food insecurities by providing greater access to fresh fruits and vegetables and more nutritious food. We all have barriers. Some just have it worse than others. The health history of the Navajo is directly related to the Navajo social, political, and economic history. Their traditional historic lifestyle of gathering, cultivating, and hunting for food required high levels of physical activity. The introduction of sheep herding by the Spanish and the maintenance of an active lifestyle allowed the Navajo good health until the forces of poverty, the U.S. government Indian policies, and diseases began to take their toll on the population. Forced relocation led to undernutrition and diseases. A more sedentary lifestyle coupled with limited poor nutritional habits due to limited resources and poverty to include limited access to health care is likely the cause for the disparities and chronic diseases seen in the Navajo people. Designing a health system that is efficient and effective in both the prevention and treatment of disease is a challenging task for all. The goal is to design a more effective and efficient future health system, emphasizing health promotion, disease prevention, and effective clinical services for the Navajo Nation by decreasing their risk exposure and providing the necessary resources which they have been deprived of for centuries. This concludes my presentation. Thank you all for listening.